Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian here at the Ramsey County Libraries, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday with the Scholar today. This program is brought to you through a co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota and with the financial support of the Ramsey County Libraries. We are deeply grateful to both of these organizations for making this program possible. Okay, so today's speaker is Michael Corey. He is the Associate Director at Mapping Prejudice, a program out of the University of Minnesota. Michael is the Geospatial, Technical, and Data Lead Associate Director for Mapping Prejudice. Before transitioning to public history, Michael spent 20 years as a journalist and data journalist at the Star Tribune. Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting and the Des Moines Register. His previous work has spanned zoning, segregation, mortgage disparities, the U.S.-Mexico border fence system, human-induced earthquakes, and sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. So, without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Michael.
Thanks very much, Kay. It's great to see all of you here. This is always a little bit of a challenge for me because I love talking with the crowd that I can't see you, but it's great to see the number of people here today. And thanks, Kay, for that great introduction. We're going to share my screen, make sure that's all working here. All good? Okay. And as Kay mentioned, I work for Mapping Prejudice. We're based at the University of Minnesota Libraries, and we're an interdisciplinary team of public historians, researchers. I'm a former data journalist, and we're all here to sort of talk about these histories that are too often not talked about, and the ways in which our cities and our communities are shaped by histories of racism. And the way we do that is primarily through the study of what's called racial covenants. And so what's a covenant, first of all? So a covenant generally is a provision in a property sale that limits the buyer's use of their property in some way. So when people talking about property rights being absolute, there's a number of ways in which property rights are not absolute, and there are limitations on what you can do with your property. And a covenant often, quote, runs with the land, meaning that is a restriction that's binding on future buyers as well. And some covenants will say for 5 years, some will say for 20 years, some will say forever. And it's important to note that not all restrictive covenants are racial covenants. Sometimes people use that term interchangeably, but restrictive covenants just means any kind of covenant. And there's other covenants like setback requirements, how far back a building has to be from the sidewalk, the size of a property, what type of shutters the building has to have, what types of uses. But the type we're going to talk about today is racial covenants, which govern who is theoretically allowed to be or not be on the property. And before I go any further, I don't think it'll be entirely surprising, given that you signed up for this talk, you sort of know what's coming. I think that because we're talking about racial covenants and racism, we're going to see some racist and outdated language coming up in the next couple slides, because we're going to see some examples of racial covenants, and I'm going to read from those racial covenants. And I just want to let you know that that can be really overwhelming for some people at some time. And if that's sort of like not really what you signed up for today, particularly because I can't see you, like feel free to like take a break, duck out, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, but just know that that is coming. And here we go. So this is an example of a racial covenant. This is actually the earliest racial covenant we found in a property in Minnesota. This is from 1910, and it's from the south side of Minneapolis. And it says that it is further mutually covenanted that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And this covenant, as I think there's sometimes a misconception that racial covenants are put on like big houses or mansions or things like that. And that's not usually what we find. And this covenant is a great example of that. This is put on a very modest house with a chicken coop out back. And that is really the sweet spot for where most racial covenants are found, is this attainable middle class or working class housing. And where it's somewhat exceptional that you see very wealthy homes have racial covenants, partly because for those more expensive homes, the cost itself is seen as a barrier for people who people don't want to be in these properties to not be able to access those. And you can see here some terms that are familiar to us and seem legible, and some that are less familiar. And so you see Chinese, Japanese, Moorish. What the heck does that mean? Like, why are people concerned about Moorish people moving into Minnesota? Why do people care about Turkish people? What does Mongolian mean? And so, like, in these early covenants in particular, we see this language that is based in 19th century race science, very much in quotes. These non-scientific ideas about race that are purporting to be very scientific. And so Mongolian is one of these terms that is referring to the supposed like overarching races of people that people believed in back in the day. And so Mongolian in this case almost certainly refers to Asian people who are seen to be as members of this group. But partly why I'm dwelling on this is that Mongolian could also refer to Native American people. Native American people were also considered to be from the Mongolian family of races. And I talk about this because it's a little ambiguous sometimes who exactly is being targeted by these covenants and who is not. And I always think we should be careful about that. But one thing that we know after now having looked at more than 76,000 covenants around the country is that there are some patterns. And one of those patterns is that basically every covenant that we've ever seen, with the exception of literally one or two, targets Black people. And that is a different history than we see with other groups. Other groups kind of come and go. And it is common to see covenants that target Asian people. It is common to see covenants that target Jewish people, but all of the covenants target Black people. And I think that it's important to note that that is a different intensity of this history. Here's another one. This one is from Anoka County, Hiawatha Beach in 1931. And this one says, and no person or persons other than of the Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy said premises. And here we see, instead of who can't be there, we see who can be there, white people or Caucasians only. And you can see again that this language, while purporting to be scientific and legal, is also ambiguous. So, for example, do Jewish people count as Caucasian? It depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's something that can be leveraged against people. But the word Caucasian is the most common term we see in racial covenants. It's in about 40% of the covenants we see nationwide. Here's another one. This one is from Benton County, and this was found by our collaborators at the College of St. Ben's, led by Professor Brittany Merritt and her students. And it says, said premises shall not be sold, leased, or rented, or occupied by any person of the Negro, Oriental, Semitic, or Indian races, or who has the blood of any said races, except as limited by present laws or treaties. And so here we do see Jewish people directly targeted, and in Minnesota, we see that about 1 to 2% of the covenants explicitly mention Jewish people, and we see Native Americans explicitly named. And this is something that we have not seen as often, and we are kind of wondering if we'll see more of those as we move out to wider areas of the state. Um, and the language here about treaties is really interesting, but so there's a lot going on here, and I think that racial covenants, in addition to being these racist documents, also teach us a lot about the way people saw people in different spaces in our country, and how land should be used, and like the different ways in which different restrictions can be used against people. Here's one that I always make sure I show. Shall not be sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person other than the white or Caucasian Aryan branch race. And the reason I will show this is this one is from Richfield, and this one is from 1946. This is from the year after we finished fighting World War II, to supposedly get rid of language like Aryan, but still someone felt comfortable putting that in a property record on the south side of the Twin Cities in 1946. And just one more I want to show you. This one is actually from 1919. This is from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And it simply said premises shall never be occupied by a colored person. So why am I showing you this covenant from Eau Claire, Wisconsin? This is because this is the covenant that's on my parents' house. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the experience of finding out that that covenant was there, and how we experienced that, because I think it says something about the ways in which covenants worked both in the past and are still with us today. So we found out about this covenant being on the house when I was about 12, and my parents refinanced the mortgage. And I don't really remember like if they found it in their stack of papers, or if the mortgage broker flagged it for them. But they came to me and my brother and they said, "Hey, did you know there is this clause in our deed that says a black person can never own the house?" And I remember thinking, "Huh, that's such a strange thing. Like, there's not even any black people here. Like, why would you need that?" And like the fact that I did not make any connection in my head at all that there might be a connection between the fact that there are no black people in my neighborhood and very few black people in my community, and the fact that this document was here, I think speaks volumes about the ways in which covenants were really successful in transforming our cities to the point where someone like me, raised in the 90s, could not even conceive of the fact that a different type of neighborhood was possible. And it seemed to me to be perfectly normal that everyone in my neighborhood looked like me, had the same kind of job as me. And racial covenants are a very powerful force in that uh, in that generation of our understanding of what an ideal neighborhood looks like, of what an ideal city looks like, and what is natural. But the case I'm trying to make to you today is that there is nothing natural about the segregation that these documents and other technologies of segregation created. And I think that this is an experience that I've seen with a lot of other white people, like particularly in communities like I grew up in, is that like they just don't have a lot of experience in engaging with these topics because of how successful things like this were at segregating neighborhoods, and that leaves them not very well equipped to have these conversations. And that's why we have talks like this, where people who may not have been brought up with any of this information can have a little more information and understand a little bit better what the context of these documents is. Because what I didn't understand and what my parents didn't understand is this wasn't just some curiosity that happened to be in my house's chain of title. This was almost certainly on every house in the neighborhood on my street. And as our research has shown, racial covenants were deployed across a vast swath of residential land all across the country. And so you can see here our map to date of the Twin Cities area documenting the spread of covenants across our cities. And you can see the covenants really encircling the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul um, here, and they're building a wall in these areas that are developing at this time. And the animation is going to start over in just a second. And what we see is that, as I mentioned, we see these just starting as experiments in sort of the early teens in Minnesota. They really take off in the 20s, and our first peak of them in the Twin Cities is about 1925. When you get to the Great Depression, really almost all development really slows down, and so you don't have as many covenants because you don't have as much house building. Period. And then covenants really come roaring back as we come out of World War II, as we have a housing shortage as GIs are returning um, to find housing in these communities. And you also see as you get into the 40s and 50s that they're spreading out in these lake areas, and we see a lot of that, like these later covenants around lakes. Um, and I think in the same way that covenants in the city are very associated with houses that we think of like bungalows and craftsmen's and things like this. I think another thing I would suggest is that in outer lying areas, they're very associated with another quintessential Minnesota phenomenon, the lake house. And this is brand new. You were the first people to see these slides. We are also doing work in Rochester, Olmsted County. We just finished mapping Olmsted County because covenants are not just something that happens in the big city. Covenants are happening in all of these smaller communities too that are developing in the first half of the 20th century. And you can see, and I want to talk about this area specifically here. If any of you know Rochester, this is the Pill Hill area of Rochester. This is where a lot of the doctors at the Mayo Clinic were living, and that's not a coincidence. As we found in these records, the Mayo organization, and there's an organization called the Mayo Property Owners Organization, is very involved in popularizing covenants and making sure that as land is getting developed, these covenants are being added and are being enforced. And I think like if you know something about the history of the Mayo brothers themselves, this fits very much into their worldview. I mean, they were dedicated to racial exclusion and racism, and I think it's another it's important to look at these connections between like who is involved in creating these systems and what else are they doing. And I don't think and so I think there's a lot more to learn here, and this is something that the Rochester community has been hearing about a little bit, but I think is going to start hearing a lot more about. But at the same time, it's really interesting that the Mayo organization has engaged with this process, and I think and at least is saying that they are interested in learning more about this history. So I find that encouraging as well. Um, we also just finished Sherburne County, which is one county northwest of Anoka County, so up kind of where Elk River is. And in Sherburne County, what we're seeing is the lakes are the story. And so here are some around Elk Lake. Here's some around Lake Fremont and Zimmerman, and we're sort of seeing them scattered around. And I think the situation we're seeing here is not a huge number of covenants, but the covenants we are seeing are very late, and that seems to be the pattern in these lake areas. We're also seeing covenants in areas that are more rural. We were very fortunate that a independent researcher who lives up in Brainerd reached out to us, and she had actually identified more than 1,000 covenants in Cass County and Crow Wing County, and so these are in these very like quintessential Minnesota lakes areas. Also, definitely have covenants on them that are being put in by Twin Cities developers in this, and these tend to be actually fairly early. Another lake here in Cass County. And so we're really seeing covenants everywhere we look. Like anywhere where development is going on from the teens through the 1950s in Minnesota, you're going to see covenants. It's not just an urban story. And it's so interesting that for many people like me, we had never heard of these things because at the time that they were being used, there was nothing secret about them. They were advertised widely in newspapers as amenities on properties. And so this is an ad for the Frankson's Como Park edition, which, as you might guess, is in Como Park in St. Paul. And if you picture yourself standing at the gate of the state fair, because I think almost everyone on this call has probably stood outside the gate of the state fair, and then you kind of turn yourself around and you look to your left and you know where that Job Corps building is, that Humphrey Job Corps building, everything north of there, that's the area we're talking about. And that's all covenanted. Um, and Thomas Frankson, who's putting in Frankson's Como Park, he puts the covenant right in the text of these ads. He says, "Fourth, that grantee cannot sell or lease real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law." Well, what does that mean? What was the penalty for breaking a covenant? And the way covenants work is that if you sold your house to a person that was not white, you could be sued. And if you were found to have done that, the property would actually revert to not even the previous owner. It would revert to the heirs of the original owner of the property. So theoretically, you would lose the property. And there are cases where this happens, but most of the time you don't need to go to court to enforce these things. The way that racial covenants generally work is because people know these things are in place. A realtor is not going to show a non-white person in the house. The seller is not going to sell. Is not going to entertain an offer from a non-white person. And so it's just the threat of these things being here is how they work. So you never get to that point of having a court case. So where do these things come from? Um, they start out as an experimental practice among real estate agents, and in this early part of like from like the 1890s to the 1900s, realtors are really trying to reinvent their public image because they have a terrible public image. They are seen as being non-trustworthy, as fraudulent, and for some good reason. And so they are trying to professionalize themselves and cast themselves in a different light as builders of sustainable and desirable and profitable neighborhoods. And there also is a perception that development in cities is out of control. And there's some truth to this. Like, I mean, you have like subdivisions going in next to factories and things like that. And so this is the origin at this time of zoning. Um, and some of those impulses are understandable. Like no one wants to live downwind from a factory, right? Like, but part of that project is people also saying one of the things that's going to make your neighborhood desirable and stable, and we'll talk about what that word means, is that it's going to be racially exclusive. And so you see people like Edmund Walton, who put in that first covenant in Minneapolis, experimenting with these things. And at first, they kind of keep them secret. Edmund Walton doesn't actually file that original deed for several years after it's actually signed because he's not sure if people will go for it. Um, but what starts out as an experiment becomes adopted as a widespread practice by other developers and real estate agents who see that people do actually want this. And so this is from the National Association of Realtors handbook from 1924. A realtor shall never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So there's this language about property values, and we're very familiar with this language of property values today. But again, like what did they mean? How were people who are not white going to affect these property values? And there were a couple of theories that people had at the time. One is just the overtly racist idea that people who were not white were just unhygienic and didn't know how to live and didn't have high standards, and that was a commonly held belief. But the other thing that's going on is that they assume that there's going to be trouble if people from different racial groups are mixing, and they just don't believe that it's possible for people of different racial groups or ethnic groups to live together in harmony. And that if that happens, that's going to lead to the lowering of property values because white people will not tolerate it and white people will leave. And I think it's important to dwell on that is that like what's bringing down the property values is the white people's attitudes, not the presence of people of color in the neighborhood. And what starts out as this private real estate practice really gets a shot in the arm by the New Deal. And this is another thing I wish I could get people to understand more is that this history of racism is not a partisan thing. Like there is plenty of blame to go around. And the New Deal is actually a really strong and powerful force in spreading segregation and institutionalizing segregation. Because when the FHA was created, to that really was revolutionizing who could get a home loan, and it's making home ownership be in reach for a much wider range of people who wouldn't have been able to access credit in the same way. Uh, and so FHA loans are giving people access to loans on much more favorable terms, much more easily than would have been available in the past. But um, the problem here is that they also adopt these real estate best practices that have been private practices for a while. And so the FHA manual says generally a high rating, meaning the best loan terms that a bank should be given only where adequate and properly enforced zoning regulations exist or where effective restrictive covenants are recorded against the entire tract, since these provide the surest protection against undesirable encroachment and inharmonious use. And the code word here is undesirable encroachment. What they mean by undesirable encroachment is people who don't belong there moving into the neighborhood. And the other thing you can see here is that they're twinning covenants and zoning. They see these as part of the same project. And so I think what happens when courts start ruling that covenants are unenforceable, what happens is they take all that overtly racial language that's in racial covenants or in redlining maps, and they cross all that out. But they leave everything else there, like the zoning restrictions and other housing restrictions that we still have today. And that doesn't mean that all of those are racist, but I think it's important that we note that those were all part of the same project and a similar vision of what a neighborhood should look like. And I think that's really important as we grapple with the legacies of that today. And I think there's a misconception, or at least I grew up with this misconception. And I don't think anyone ever overtly told me this, but the impression I had growing up in Wisconsin, like not too far away, is that the further back in time you go, the more segregated our communities were. And what the evidence actually shows is that's not the case. And so this is a map showing Black population of the Twin Cities in 1910. All we really have is Minneapolis and St. Paul. We don't have the suburbs for that time period. And what you can see here is that you have all these places where you have purple is somewhere where Black people are living. And yeah, you can see areas where it's all white and there's no Black people living. But the key point here is that those areas that are like don't have many Black people living there, there's not much development there, period. And I would argue that what we're seeing here is that everywhere that white people are living, Black people are also living in 1910. I'm not saying everything was a bed of roses, but there are not generally geographic restrictions on where Black people can live at the start of the 20th century. And but the other thing you can see here in 1910 is these very first experiments with covenants, and they're probably a little small on your screen, but these little green things here are the very first covenants to go in. And as we move into 1920 and covenants start spreading, what you start to see is these areas that previously had Black people living in them are going to start to get cleaned out. And I also going to go back here. I want you to note that there's not really that strong of concentration of Black residents into these neighborhoods that we know today and prior to 1910 either. You can see the origins of the Rondo community over here. You can see the near north side over here. But but critically, like these are not like 75% Black neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are like 30% Black. These are diverse neighborhoods at the time. But really, as we move into the 20s, we start seeing these more concentrated areas of Black settlement on the near north side in Cedar Riverside, which is then called Seven Corners, the old South Side, and Rondo. because as these covenants are taking effect and as people's attitudes are changing, it is increasingly unsafe for Black people to live anywhere other than these places that have been seen as acceptable for people to live. And by 1930, you can, as you see the number of covenants increasing, you see again this increasing neighborhoods of Black settlement. And by 19, whoops, and by 1940, particularly on like the south side of Minneapolis, these covenants have really done their work. They have cleared out the south side of Minneapolis of Black population. Um, and interestingly, if we flash forward to a map of 2020, even though the Twin Cities is much more diverse today, like and there's a much larger number of people of color living in the community, the overall racial patterns are still pretty similar to what we saw in 1940. The whitest areas of the city, of the Twin Cities, are still these areas that had racial covenants. But now, wait a minute. Some of you are saying, "Wait a minute. I know how to read a map. I see some problems here, Mister Historian, man. Like, what's going on here in Matt Groveland? Like, there's not that many covenants here. What's going on over here by Lake Harriet? There's some covenants, but not that many here." Um, and what we'd argue is that the flip side of these covenants is always a threat of violence. What happens if you violate it? And what we see even before racial covenants take off is a change in white attitudes about where Black people can be. And actually, the first thing that they try is just direct violence again against their Black neighbors. And so, as we see in other parts of the country, we see a lot of Black families who either have been living in these neighborhoods already or who are newly moving to these neighborhoods are suddenly facing determined resistance from white people. And a lot of these incidents that I'm going to talk about are in these areas where like there's not covenants, but there is violence. And I want to talk about two examples. One, this is in the Matt Groveland neighborhood of St. Paul. Some of you may be familiar with the Groveland Barber Shop, which is right across the street from Groveland Park Elementary School on St. Clair Avenue. And that barbershop was built by this man here, Turner Starks. And Turner Starks was born in Mississippi and was in the Twin Cities by the 1880s and opened a series of barbershops, starting kind of over on Western Avenue by where Nina's Coffee is. And then he moved downtown. And then he started moving out with development of St. Paul along Grand Avenue. And he opened a shop like kind of on the east side of Grand Avenue. Then he opened a shop over by McAllister on Grand Avenue. And then in 1923, he decides that he's going to build a shop for his son Ernest on St. Clair Avenue. And when that happens, the neighbors mobilize, and a coalition of both the Neighborhood Improvement Association and the KKK mobilize to make sure that Turner Starks is not going to be able to operate this barbershop. And some people are surprised to learn that the KKK was active in Minnesota, but the KKK is quite active in all states, and Minnesota is no exception. Um, and the Starks family undergoes more than 2 years of for both legal harassment and racial terror, where they're threatened, and eventually a shot is fired through the window of the Groveland barbershop, then called the Starks Barbershop, on Halloween night in 1924. So basically 100 years ago. Um, and they and eventually Turner Starks concludes that it's just not going to be possible for his son to operate this shop. And while he technically maintains ownership of the shop, he leases it to a white barber. Um, and another story from Minneapolis. This is the Edith and Arthur Lee family. They moved into South Minneapolis in 1938, so a little later. Arthur Lee, like many people who were sort of pushing the boundaries of what had come to be seen as white space, was a World War I veteran and a postal worker, and he and his family decided they wanted to move into this non-covenanted neighborhood in South Minneapolis. And again, the neighbors immediately mobilize, and huge crowds start forming outside the house. And at one point, 3,000 people surround their house and threaten violence against them. They throw paint on the wall. They smash windows. They threaten to burn the house down. And the only reason they don't burn the house down, or worse, is because Arthur Lee's fellow World War I veterans come to the house armed and surround the house and protect the house with guns. Um, and they're able to hold on for a while, but eventually they too decide there's just not a way forward for them to live in this neighborhood. And I think people who don't know this history find this shocking that this is happening in the Twin Cities, but this is very common. And I think feeling understanding that this is also happening at the same time as covenants help fills in some of the gaps in those neighborhoods, because if you have violence, you don't need racial covenants. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. And in some ways, racial covenants are pitched as this idea, well, if you have a covenant, you don't have to go to all the trouble of violently running people out of your neighborhood. And that's part of the way the amenity works. And that's part of what they mean by stable neighborhoods. And a lot of people are familiar with redlining maps, and it's because there's redlining maps for most major cities. But part of what I would want to say about redlining maps is that you remember those areas we saw in the 1940s where originally people are not concentrated into these neighborhoods, and racial covenants and violence are concentrating them into these neighborhoods. And we would argue that you can't redline people until you force them into these small areas. It's not possible to circle them on a map until they've all been concentrated. And what we see with the federal redlining programs, and redlining basically means that the federal government is helping determine who's going to be able to get what quality of loans, and they rate neighborhoods based on like how valuable they are seen and how safe of an investment they're seen to be for home loans. And so redlining refers to these red areas where that are seen as undesirable for lending. And so those neighborhoods are targeted for you're not going to get good loan rates, and realtors are going to say, well, you don't want to be there. That's not a good investment. By contrast, and I think this doesn't get as much attention as it should, you also have the blue and green neighborhoods, which are getting investment and are seen as desirable. These are the ones by the lakes. These are the ones where the houses are being kept up. And so you start to have these diverging paths where some neighborhoods, they get good parks, they get good schools, they get good loans, and there's a cycle of wealth building. While other neighborhoods, you can't get a loan, they're not desirable, the resale values are low, and they're going to be where industrial areas are placed. And another moment in this history that doesn't get talked about very often is the GI Bill. Some of you may be familiar with the GI Bill as this program for returning veterans from World War II, because at the end of World War II, there is this huge housing shortage because the construction industry has been suffering from the Great Depression and from everyone being engaged in war work. And so when GIs come back, partly as a reward for their service, there's a massive building campaign, and then there's this new program called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act that develops VA loans, which give very favorable loan terms to returning GIs. But it's not well known that most of those loans, or like most Black GIs, are not able to get those loans, and that's because in order to get this bill through Congress, two things happen. One is that in order to get the votes of Southern Democrats, the federal government has to agree that the administration of this program will be left to states, so they can keep their Jim Crow regimes in place as they're considering who gets these loans. Um, but the other thing is they adopt the FHA guidelines for how these loans are going to be doled out, which say you have to have covenants, you have to have exclusive zoning, all that stuff. That's part of what is happening in the VA program. And partly because the states are administering these programs, it's kind of hard to get data. Like, so I've never been able to find good Minnesota data on this. But what we do know, again, shows that it's very difficult for Black veterans or other minorities to access these loans. So in New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, this is data we do have, of the 67,000 mortgages insured under the GI Bill, fewer than 100 went to non-white applicants. So this is another place where it's not just that Black applicants are left out. It's that this is the moment when a lot of white families get a foot on the ladder of home ownership and start building wealth. And so you have these diverging functions. And again, this is our map of Black population in 1940. But as we move forward in time, um, and you have these neighborhoods where now there's only a few places where like particularly Black people can safely live um, in the Twin Cities. The freeways are announced. And lo and behold, when the freeways go through in the early 60s, they manage to find every Black neighborhood in the Twin Cities. And this is not just the Twin Cities. This is every city in America. But I think, again, like we don't really remember how disruptive the construction of the freeways was. In the city of Minneapolis alone, more than 24,000 people were displaced to build freeways. 24,000 people. And most of those people who were displaced were white. But the big difference is that the white people who are displaced by the freeways, they can go wherever they want, and they do. They almost exclusively go to like much wider suburbs than they had previously been living in before, because they're really only limited by the money in their bank account. But this is before fair housing. There's no fair housing legislation. And so like even if you could afford a house, no one has to sell you a house. And so while white people move to the suburbs, black people and other people of color are basically forced to remain in these areas near the new freeways. And these freeways have the impact of taking neighborhoods that had been diverse and desirable, like Rondo and the old South Side, and they've now made them less desirable by putting them next to this freeway. And they've either cut them off from access to a lot of the amenities in the neighborhood, which is the case on the south side of Minneapolis, or they've run right through the main drag in Rondo, which was always part of the intention of the freeways project to clear blight. And these neighborhoods are targeted early on. I don't think it was a surprise or an accident that they found these neighborhoods. So I've been laying out this larger story than racial covenants right now. And what I'd like you to take away from this is that it's not just one thing. What we're talking about is this century that's building on even prior discrimination and like the theft of land from Native people. There's this century of successive waves of disruption and displacement and investment for other people. So it's not a surprise that we end up with the disparities that we have today, because you've got this era of overt um, segregation with racial covenants, redlining, mortgage discrimination, municipal zoning ordinances that just say only black people can only live here. And then when we get to the era of civil rights legislation where that stuff is ruled illegal, that's replaced by more implicit projects like gerrymandering, modern lending discrimination, um, and blockbusting, or things like that. So it's really no surprise that these things have built on each other. And racial covenants sort of have a long death. They take a long time to really go away. Um, by the 1940s, racial covenants are the number one target of activism by the NAACP. They are talking all the time about it. They're extremely active in filing lawsuits against it. And in 1948, the Supreme Court rules that covenants are unenforceable, that the government cannot enforce a racial covenant. And I will say, like, this was, by the way, the NAACP's third case before the Supreme Court about covenants. And the judges previously twice ruled that covenants were acceptable. But by 1948, they do manage to get the court to agree that they're unenforceable because they're a violation of the 14th Amendment. But that doesn't make them go away. And remember earlier when I said we have a lot of these late covenants around lakes and outlying areas. Lots of people put in covenants after 1948 because even if it wasn't legally enforceable, they want to send the message. They want to put that social pressure on that it's still not acceptable for people to be in these spaces. In 1953, Minnesota bars new racial covenants, and we do see them greatly decrease after that. But we do still see people putting in some racial covenants as late as the mid 60s. Um, Even though by 1963, Minnesota bars housing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and national origin. And I want to pause on this a little bit too, because I think this is often remembered. If people do know this history, they take this as a sign that says, look how progressive Minnesota was. We were ahead of the US Fair Housing Act by 5 years. Isn't it great? Isn't that something to celebrate? And I think like it is good that Minnesota passed this law, but it's important to understand the context of why that law was passed in 1963. That law was passed in 1963 because lots of groups like the NAACP and church groups were screaming from the rooftops that the construction of freeways after the routes were announced in the late 50s were going to be extremely challenging for Black residents in particular. They knew that these freeways were probably going to go through Black neighborhoods and that Black people would have an extremely hard time relocating. And so that kicked off this huge successive rounds of activism trying to get state, local, and federal authorities to do something about the fact that it was not going to be possible for Black residents to find new housing. And mostly those all failed. The state really wouldn't directly engage. The federal government kept saying it was somebody else's job. And both Minneapolis and St. Paul try and fail to pass open housing ordinances as freeway displacement starts happening. And the reasoning was they tried to make an argument that like, well, we don't have the power to do this, but there's a really interesting reversal in this time period of what's considered property rights, because the realtors and the building industry was lobbying very hard and saying that actually the 14th Amendment supports them and saying they shouldn't have to sell their house to someone who they didn't want to. And so property rights weren't something that Black people should have access to. Property rights were for people who already had property and that they had a right to discriminate essentially. And I think it's very interesting in this current moment that you see the way in which the 14th Amendment, which was passed to give equal rights to former slaves, was perverted to make this argument that actually it was people who already had the property who had the rights and nobody else did. Um, and so this 1963 law is passed by a Republican governor after years of lobbying, and really it's passed too late to help most of the people displaced by the freeways in the Twin Cities. Most of that displacement happens in 1960 through 1962. So by the time they do pass this law, the damage has already been done. And then in 1968, finally, the U.S. does pass the Fair Housing Act, which theoretically makes all of these overt racial discrimination illegal. But some people will say, well, that was a long time ago, but I know there's people on this call who don't feel like 1968 was that long ago. But the reason this is important today is because we are presented with these glaring disparities still today. So in the Twin Cities has the largest gap in the nation between white homeownership and Black homeownership, where in the Twin Cities, 75% of white families own their home, while only 33% of Black families can make that claim. And nationwide, we're not really all that much better off than we were in 1968, despite more than 50 years of supposedly illegal discrimination. And the Great Recession was a big setback in this regard. Uh, but despite this legislation, we have not meaningfully cracked this disparity. And partly what our research has powered is other researchers to be able to do more detailed research on this. And so this is showing that houses that had a covenant back in the day in 2019 were still worth 15% more than a non-covenanted house, while redline homes in redline neighborhoods, were still worth 25% less than the median value. So the disparities are still with us. So that means that someone like me, if my parents ever either sell their house or if I inherit the house and sell that property, that implies that I will likely make a premium off the fact that there was a racial covenant on there. And that's not because anyone today like knows there's a racial covenant or wants to live in a covenanted neighborhood. It's because we've had this century of investment in some neighborhoods and divestment from other neighborhoods. And so I think sometimes it's easy for white people to say, like, well, I don't see myself in this history. But this is the way in which, like, if we lived in these spaces that had these advantages, where we are involved, like I'm gonna make a profit off of this someday in 2025. And this is not about guilt. Like, I think people like worry about that sometimes right now. Like, that doesn't mean like it wasn't my idea to be born in a covenanted neighborhood. My parents didn't move there because it was a covenanted neighborhood. So it's not about guilt, but we are involved, and I think that's the case we're trying to make, that we all have a stake in what happens next. So what can you do about it? One is just talk about it. Tell your friends and family what you have learned. I think particularly for white people, we just don't have a lot of experience about talking about these things out loud, and we don't have the language, and we're scared to talk about these things out loud. Um, you can also help us research covenants and racial violence in your community. I'll show a QR code at the end. We are currently transcribing deeds in, I think, 4 different counties. We've got, um, I'm blanking, Contra Costa County, California, Washington, D.C. We have some new Ramsey County deeds that we didn't get the first time up, and North Carolina, and we have Stearns County coming soon. Another big one is be honest about your institution's role in historically racist practices, whether that's the University of Minnesota, whether that's other community amenities. And I think it's been really powerful to see the ways in which some people have taken that on. So I mentioned that like realtors were a huge part in building the system that we have today. But like realtors have also been some of our biggest allies. Not all realtors, but like the Minneapolis area Realty Association has been a huge advocate for doing training about this. And MAR, the Minneapolis area realtors, actually issued an apology a couple of years ago for their role in helping to create housing segregation. And that's a symbolic action, but I think that's a really powerful action that people can say, like, yeah, we acknowledge that we had this role, and that means we can do something different. Um, Another big one for me is that we hear somewhat often from people of color you know what? It's great that like mapping prejudice is out there and people are listening to them. They're listening to the research that these mostly white researchers are doing, and that they're getting all this attention for that. But Black people and other people of color have been talking about this stuff for 100 plus years. Like I said, the only reason that racial covenants were ruled unenforceable is because of the activism of very determined Black people in the face of massive resistance. And so, as we're talking about what do we do next and how do we fix these things, we need the guidance to come from people living with the consequences of these policies. So when people are good enough to tell us what they need, we need to be listening and not putting our own spin on what we think might be an acceptable speed or an acceptable remedy. Um, and we need to work to change policy and structures. And so it's been really great that as we reveal more areas that have racial covenants, community organizations, whole cities have been really invested in. Well, we want to do something. We want to discharge these racial covenants that we have, and that's great. We support that. But we also think it's important to understand that discharging these racial covenants is the start of a conversation and not the end. Because discharging a racial covenant does not do anything to undo the damage that was done over these last 100 years. And if we want these places to be truly welcoming places, if we want people to truly have a shot at a neighborhood that is welcoming, we're going to have to undo some of this damage that we spent 100 years doing. And that brings me to the next bullet point with the R word, which people always get really scared when we talk about reparations. But again, like I would hope that I've laid out a compelling case here today that we have had these. It's not a simple thing where if we just fix the rules and make it not rigged, everyone's starting from the same place, because we're not starting from the same place. We're starting from a place where some people have had 100 years of advantages and other people have had 100 plus years of disadvantages. And you all know what housing prices are now and how competitive getting a house is. Like the idea that if we just take away the discrimination, that everyone's going to be able to compete in the housing market, that's a fantasy. And so like if we're ever going to make progress on these things, we need to decide it's not just that these things were wrong in the past. We need to decide that we're going to fix the damage. And that at its core is what reparations is talking about. And reparations can mean a lot of different things. For example, Washington State just passed a law um, that is adding $100 fee to every real estate transaction in the state, which that's a lot of money, right? Like $100 on every fee. And that's going into a fund to support down payment assistance for the descendants of people who were targeted by these histories. That's reparations. Like that is making a difference in people's lives today by undoing some of the damage that was done in the past. Um, and I know like I've laid out a lot of like really tough history over here, and I want to say that particularly in this moment, that people are capable of doing different things and of making change. And so this is what's going on recently. So Edmund Boulevard, which is along the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, is named for Edmund Walton, who brought that first racial covenant to Minnesota. And over the last year, like last couple of years, a group of residents organized to change that. And so just like in the past month or so, it was finally formalized that Edmund Boulevard was changed to Lena Smith Boulevard. And I think it's particularly appropriate because Lena Smith was Arthur and Edith Lee's attorney, the family in South Minneapolis that was targeted for violence. And I can't think of anyone better to represent what's really great about Minnesota than the first Black woman lawyer who fought against these segregationist activities. And so there's good news out there too. And I'll close just with this, that like we all know what's going on in the country today. And I think like particularly for someone doing this kind of work, we have to spend a lot of time explaining that yes, people do care about this history. And I think there's this message out there that no one wants to talk about this. It's the wrong time. Wouldn't it be better if we just shut up about it? Haven't we done enough? And I just think like that's all meant to distract us from the fact that I want to look at the Zoom right now. There's 149 of you here today. No one's paying you to be here. You're interested in this history. And I think this is our experience over and over again, is that of course people want to talk about this because it's just interesting, like first of all, and because it's important that we understand the real truth about the history of our country. Because whether we decide to talk about it or not, this history is not going anywhere. And Isabel Wilkerson has a great thing in her books that she's talking about where our country is like an old house in a lot of ways, right? Like, I mean, if you have an old house, as I do, and you got a problem with your roof, there's a leak in your roof. Ignoring it is not going to make that problem go away. It's just going to make it worse. It's going to fester. It's going to mutate. It's going to turn into something worse. And that's where we are right now. Is that like we can decide that we're just going to shove this down and put it away for another generation to deal with. But I don't want that to be the legacy I leave to my kids, and I hope you don't want that same thing either. And so let's just keep going. And with that, like if you'd like to join us at an upcoming session, we'd love to see you. Like I said, and I'm looking forward to hopefully a lot of good questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, so looking at our questions, very first one, when and how did these covenants stop being enforced?
Well, it's a good question. Like theoretically, they're not supposed to be unenforceable after 1948. And like so you couldn't go to court after 1948 and have one of these enforced. But I don't think that's the end of covenants being enforced because, as I mentioned, the way that covenants are enforced is by neighborhood pressure. Um, and so I think that people were still like I said, people are still putting new ones in after 1948. Like, and there's a lot of them until like the early 50s, and even some as late as the mid 60s. And so I don't think we should imagine that somehow these became super welcoming places to be after 1953 or 1960. Particularly, these neighborhood dynamics have already been laid down. And I think another answer to this is there was a case a couple years ago in Oklahoma where someone was trying to fight the development, like the someone opening a grocery store who was a African American man, and they found that there was an old covenant, and they tried to have it enforced in like 2024, and obviously they couldn't do that legally. But particularly, I think now when we have this new era of immigrants from other countries who are not as familiar with this history, and they encounter some of these things, like I think there is a danger of a chilling effect there too. So I think like legally there's a couple different answers. You could say 1948, you could say 1968, but I don't think the attitudes of who does and doesn't belong in a neighborhood went away. And I think that's what we need to pay attention to is are our neighborhoods even today still truly welcoming for people who don't fit the norm of who belongs in those neighborhoods?
Okay, how do I find out if a property has a racial covenant tied to it?
So in the counties where we've worked, you can look at our map, and I would say like if there's something in green there, like we found a covenant, like we're very sure there's a covenant there. If you're in an area where there's no covenants nearby, like on the map, like that, and that might mean that either there's none or we haven't gotten to that part yet. But if you're on one of those blocks where like there's like a honeycomb and there's like a bunch of them in on half of the block, and like but your house doesn't happen to have one, the reality is that your house probably also does have a covenant, and either like the image quality was bad or we didn't find it for some reason. And so um so we've done now Hennepin County, we've done one pass at Ramsey County, but we're going to add more. We finished Anoka County, Washington County, Olmsted County, Sherburne County, and we have an MOU signed with Carver County. But if you're not in one of those communities and you'd like to find out, um, we'd love to hear from you. And really, what we need is we need people who live in these local communities to demonstrate to the public officials that they are interested in this history. Because like we're not here to break the door down and say and demand that a county work with us and like find these records. We want this to be something that is meaningful to your county. But if your county's not one of those, like tell your county board or tell your county recorder, hey, I want to know if we have these and the way to and if then we can do that work to find those because it's hard for recorders to find these on their own. Like the era of images we're talking about, they're kind of in like the stack of scanned microfilm, and so really like, and if you have your abstract of title and you look in it, if you have a covenant, you might find it, but you might not, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that title searches often only go back about 40 years, and so they don't look earlier than that. Two is that sometimes because these things are embarrassing and hurtful over the years, people sort of took them out of the stack once they became unenforceable, whether they should have or not. So you can check your deed, but and you might find it, but if you don't see it in your stack of papers, that doesn't mean there was one. There wasn't one.
Okay, how does a person go about removing a covenant?
Well, and the language we use is discharge because and a discharge in Minnesota is it gets slightly technical because there's two kinds of property ownership in Minnesota, but generally you work with a volunteer attorney usually like who is working with just deeds, And if you go to the justdeeds.org website, you can see if your city is one of the partnering organizations. And so some cities it's through the city, like Mounds View is doing this through their city attorney's office. So if you live in Mounds View, okay, maybe you already got, oh, well, you didn't have a covenant, but like I think, but if you lived in Mounds View and you had a covenant, they're actually going to mail you. But usually, you ultimately what you do is you file a document with the county that notes, here's my property, there was a covenant, here's the date, and when we disavow this covenant. And um, if you have an house that's an abstract deed, that's the process. If your house happens to be Torrens, which is very obscure property stuff, there's a slightly different process. And if you have a Torrens house, it's actually possible that your county has already removed the covenant from the chain of title because a number of counties have done that. Um, but we don't like the word removed, I'll say, because it's really important that we don't erase this history. And the way
Right.
that property records work is that when you discharge a covenant, it doesn't mean the old document goes away. It's still in the historical file. And the discharge actually is pointing the way to where this covenant was. Because the only way we can even do this research is when these things became illegal and uncool and no one wanted to talk about them, they weren't destroyed. That's why we can know this history today. So it's really important that that history is preserved as we go forward.
Mhm. Yeah, I think of that somewhat as trying to whitewash old literature by
Right. Mhm.
removing, it's like if you do that, then you deny that it was occurring.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
okay, what is a public historian?
Oh,
Someone
that's
was
a
a
great
history
question. I love that
major
question. I love that
way
question.
back, and they were like, "Going, I never heard that term used."
No, and I think that's very common. So a public historian, this is going to sound flip, is a historian who talks to the public, and that's sort of in contrast to academic historians. Often their primary output is they're going to write an academic book or they're going to write a journal article that like specialists are going to see, but they don't see their primary mission as generally engaging with the public. Like maybe they're teaching in a faculty role or something like that. A public historian is kind of the opposite of that. Like so, like even though like I need to be writing scholarly articles. I should be doing that, but we focus much more on and interacting with the public. And so we've done more than 700 presentations between 2016 and today, and we've spoken to everyone from a witches coven to the Minnesota Supreme Court justices. Because we just think it's really important to get this information into the hands of people, and I think the way that Mapping Prejudice does this work, which is like we have community members help us do the research, that's a great example of the distinction between public history and sort of regular history or academic history. Is like we really believe that if we want things to change, and I don't know why you're studying racism if you don't want things to change, like that's got to be more than just writing an article. So public historians do what I do. Public historians also work in museums, like if someone who's a researcher for a museum, things like that.
Yeah. Um, Somewhat of comment here from Don. Seems that to me that many who want to discharge covenants want to declare their personal purity when all of us should learn the lessons here and address what are we going to do about it now
Mhm.
question. Um, because
I
yeah,
and yeah, I think that like it really people's reactions really depend. And I think people have this understandable reaction when they discover that their house has a covenant on it, um, that they want to do something. And I think it's really important that they have assistance in guiding them through that process. And it's something that the Just Deeds Coalition has been really good at is helping people to understand that like if discharging that covenant is meaningful to you, that's great. Like, and I do think it's in if you feel like you want to take a stand and say, um, I want to disavow this history, I think that's a good impulse. But it doesn't mean, yep, we're done. And we also do hear from neighborhoods who say, um, yeah, we're just going to take care of this. And again, like, what is taking care of it does not undo the damage. And I think that's an ongoing conversation that people have. I also think it's important to note that like not everyone has the same experience. I think like what I've just outlined is I think a particularly white response to finding out your house has a covenant in it. And if you're a person of color who lives in these properties, your reaction may be different. And we hear different reactions from different people. There are some people of color who say, well, of course I want to discharge this. This is a stain on my house and I want it off. And I think like, of course, like that's really meaning that's important for you. Other people of color have said, I'm not discharging that thing. I'm here to say, like, we've had people say they put their covenant on their wall up in their house because they say, I'm here in defiance of that. I am proof that that didn't win. And so people have all kinds of different reactions. For us, it's really important that like if people are doing that, that it's their choice that they do it. Like that it should be because they want to do it. And so we're sort of a little iffy on when people want to make it mandatory because I do think like
Right.
it can become something either more perfunctory or maybe not meaningful or maybe you're not doing it for the right reasons. In other states, people have started wondering like, okay, well, what happens if the Supreme Court does overturn the Fair Housing Act or something like that? Like, is there any way these covenants could come back into force? And so that's a question we get sometimes: is doing a discharge going to add another layer of protection? And I think it's like it's not really clear. And in Minnesota, then even if the federal Fair Housing Act was overturned, the state still has several civil rights laws. So I don't think that would be like the first avenue. But I also understand that there's a reason people are concerned about that. But I'm not sure the discharge is going to provide the protection that people would hope for that. And so we have to protect fair housing through other means, basically.
Right. And which is why it's important to have the discussion about it in the first place that look
Right,
at what
right,
happened previously in history. And
right.
so, um, okay, here's an interesting one. Somebody lives in a condominium and
Hmm.
they've been waiting for years for action on their condo's deed. And it's like, if you're in a building, is it the building, the land that has or is it the,
That's another really good question. Okay, so I'm going to presume you're in Minnesota, and unfortunately,
yeah,
in
the
Minnesota, I
55423 zip code,
that's
which I'm
St.
not quite
Paul.
sure.
I don't know, but it's in Minnesota. So I am not sure about the answer to that. I would say like if you're in St. Paul, actually, if you're in any of the cities in Ramsey County, which I think that would be, um, contact your city attorney and see what you would do in that case. Because different cities are doing that a different way. In some states, basically anyone who's in the condo can do it. And I think it kind of depends, like, is the covenant in the underlying? So in Minnesota, usually the covenant is something that's on the original land. So if you're in a condo, the covenant was probably there before the condo was there. In other states, it is more common that the covenant is in the HOA agreement itself, and there's a separate process for that. So I'm sorry I can't give you a simple answer, but I think that my first step would be try to contact your city attorney and see what they would advise you to do.
Okay. So can you say more about reparations?
Boy, I mean, there's a lot to say about reparations, but I think again, like reparations can mean a lot of things to different people. Like there are some versions of reparations that are give people cash payments for the discrimination that was received. And like I said, there's other things where it's like, how do we do down payment assistance? And I think the main thing that distinguishes reparations from other modes is it is a means to attempt to undo the damage that was done by more than a century, more than 2 centuries, really, of racial discrimination. And I think like part of the challenge that we have right now, and we've had for a long time, is that like I think, and this is my personal opinion, like we have been trying to solve this crisis of the aftermath of all this racist developments in our country with race neutral practices because and so like how are we going to solve things that damage that was done in overtly racial ways with race neutral solutions, and like we'll try to make it about income or try to make it about class or things like that, and those are important too, but that's not the nature of the damage that we face in this country. And so again, reparations is this idea like, can we target this a little more directly? And the problem is that that really conflicts with people's understanding about like, wait a minute, I thought like we were supposed to be race neutral now. Like, how do isn't it reverse discrimination or things like that? And I think there's a lot going on right now about like litigating how that's going to shake out. So, for example, in Washington, the theory of their law is that again, like this is not a violation of equal protection. This is not reverse discrimination because this is compensation for damage that happened in the past, and they're doing that by they've done a very rigorous academic study and collected a lot of data on who was directly targeted by these things. And so they say this is not reverse discrimination, this is compensation for harm that was done to you. And I think a lot of that has not made its way through the courts yet, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. but I do think at the end of the day, like I don't know how we're going to solve our history of racism without it being directly tied to race. I just don't get how that's going to work. Like,
Okay. What are your thoughts on why, after all these years, Minnesota hasn't moved the needle on home ownership disparity?
yeah, and I think this is something that different people have different takes on and talk about all the time. I think that my impression personally is that it's been really hard for people of color to get a foothold here for a very long time, and that like people who come don't stay for that long, like because they find it challenging. And
Mhm.
so and I think that is in real contrast to the experience of a lot of white families who have like come here and found it accessible to them and built family and built roots. And so I think like that is and I think it's important to say like there have been black people in Minnesota as long as there have been white people. Like some of the earliest voyagers in Minnesota were black. But that population was very small until after World War II. And I think it's because it's just been really difficult to get a foothold here. And I would argue that part of that is because that segregation was successful. It's really hard for black Minnesotans, white neighbors, to see the the system that they've created that makes it so inaccessible, and it's hard to make progress on that. Um, so that I guess that's my personal take.
Yeah, so would you kind of say that we pride ourselves of being in the North and not being part
Mhm.
of segregation, yet the racial covenants isn't, it's the Minnesota nice way of passive
Right.
aggressiveness of we're gonna segregate, but not say that we're doing it. And when you end up doing that, then you create these two separate things where you just it's hard to come together because you're fearing the unknown.
Yeah. And I think so to build on that too, like so one of the things I study in connection with this barber shop is like, okay, are there these other incidents of racial violence in like Minneapolis and St. Paul? And it was really striking as I'm compiling these news accounts that there's such a long history of the sort of denial of the true nature of racism here.
Mhm.
And I think it's precisely because we have weaponized this ideology of what the North is versus the South. And if you look at news coverage all the way going back to the 1890s, all the way into the 1960s, like in the 1960s, there's someone burns a cross at a black church in Rondo wearing a white KKK uniform, and the newspaper like reports it, but it says, "But it was a prank." And if you look at all of these things, they always say, "But it was a prank." And I think there is this internalized view that we have in the North that we can never do a real racism because we're not the South. And I just want to tell people that that has a really long history because you see people saying that in the 1880s, 1890s in Minnesota, and they say these black people coming here, they don't know how good they have it because it's the South. And what that means to them is, and so they should know their place because they have it so good here. And I think that is a deeply held thing that we didn't decide like that we wanted. Like it's just it's in our DNA. I think if we or I mean I'll just say like it's in my DNA. Even though like I do this work, I work against it all the time, but I know it's in there, and I think it's hard to confront that sometimes.
Right. I mean, I think of going to when I was in school, I grew up in Fridley.
Hmm.
To count the number of Black families who lived and went to school with me, I could do on my hand over
Hmm.
my whole course of going to school back in the 70s. And
Hmm.
I'm just like, yeah, it's and why? It was because they wouldn't feel welcome here. And
Hmm.
why would they not feel welcome here? It's because it was hard to get into our communities as the
Hmm.
token, as a lone family. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas like somebody's pointing out they grew up in the rural South and they're like, but blacks and whites interacted
Right.
there
Hmm.
all the
And,
time, and there would be people who would have respect, and
hmm.
not everyone down there was about
Hmm.
segregation, whereas we pride ourselves on being like, oh, we're great, but um,
Well, and I can just speak from my own experience. Like, I can't tell you the name of a black person I knew until I went to college. like
Hmm.
until and like I have very liberal, progressive, anti-racist parents. But like even I checked, like even in 1990, city of 60,000 people, there were fewer than 300 Black people living in Eau Claire. Um, and I would guess that the majority of them are students at the university. And so like for me, like then when I do move to other spaces that more reflect the country, like I wasn't equipped to like to deal with that. And for me, that leads to discomfort. And I think and we can see people in our lives who that discomfort turns into fear, that discomfort turns into defensiveness, that comfort discomfort turns into resistance to like really engaging with that discomfort. Like so that's my experience. I can't speak for other people.
Um, what other topics does mapping prejudice work on? I mean, is it just racial covenants or does it
Well, like our primary research isn't these racial covenants, but it's really kind of like the span of this presentation is like we're trying to talk about all of the different interlocking ways in which race is really present in the history of our community,
Mhm.
and just trying to help people see those connections, and then really trying to use that process of learning about that as a way to get people to get comfortable taking some kind of action, like in terms of just trying to undo some of these legacies. So I mean I think like you what you've seen today is kind of that's a lot of what we do.
Okay, I have someone who's grew up near Walker, Minnesota in the 70s, just off of
Hmm.
Leech Lake Reservation,
Hmm.
and they're wondering about are there covenants directed at Native Americans and was that common?
So the first question I can answer, the second question I don't feel like I can. So there are covenants that aimed at Native Americans. I showed one earlier, but they're not the ones that explicitly mention Native people are not the norm that we've seen so far.
Hmm.
But like when you have whites only, Caucasians only, like presumably that includes Native American people. But I think it has been this sort of ongoing discussion of like what exactly does that mean? And I think particularly in the Twin Cities, part of the story is that in the imagination of the people who are putting these covenants in the 20th century, they don't need to target Native people because they're not there anymore. They're just not in their mind anymore. And to be clear, that was not true, right? Like that was never true. But in
Hmm.
the imagination of those people, they're not a concern. And we sort of wondered as we get further up, particularly as we get closer to the boundaries of modern reservations, are we going to see more of that? And I think the jury is really still out. Like the covenants that this researcher shared with us from Cass County, Crow Wing County, they look pretty much exactly like the covenants in the Twin Cities. But there's a reason for that, is that because like she didn't have access to the whole range of deeds from there. So she was just going and searching for the developers that were in our Hennepin County data set. And so like she's clearly like she's oversampling for these Twin Cities developers. And it's
Okay.
certainly possible that there are other developers who are doing something really different, but I think really the jury's still out, and that's why it is so important that we continue to do research in more types of places and to see the different ways that this worked over time.
Okay. Um, do you know if other countries have had to deal with this?
Great question. So we know that they have them in Canada, and we think that there is a pattern of former British domains having these. But I think we've wondered about this too. Like, what are the ways in which this sort of history is or the same or different from other places? I think like we sort of feel that Americans have a very particular conception and obsession with property that I think is a little different. But yeah, that we know they have them in the Toronto area, particularly around resorts. And so I am sure there are versions of this in other countries, but we primarily focus on the US. I think the Bahamas, someone found some in the Bahamas, other British former domain.
Somebody was asking if they could see the link again about volunteering.
Oh, yes. Great. I will
No,
put it up. 1 second. Um,
and while you're doing that, so there you go, people, you can scan that. Um, Many people are wondering if this is being recorded today, and yes, it is. And we will get that up on the YouTube, Ollie's YouTube channel in the near future, and then it'll be up on the Ramsey County Library website also, generally keep these up for about 2 years. So, okay, we got the link. And just, oh, okay, people, more questions. We have time.
Yes.
We have time to talk. Somebody's saying, hey, one of our best speakers we've had in Ollie,
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad.
Ramsey County Library series for a while. So you're doing
Well,
great.
thank you. And I don't know if this will work in this format, but like I would love to hear like what is people's experience with either encountering these covenants as a homeowner or someone who's targeted by them. Like if you have any of those experiences, like we'd love to hear them, like or see them.
Yeah, because part of like why I booked this is I live in Mounds View, and
Hmm.
Mounds View um, had it in their newsletter that they were working on this to start
Hmm.
discharging. There's over 500 racial covenants in the Mounds View area. Um, my house is built after the 70s
Hmm. Yeah.
and was kind of post that, so it wasn't one of
Hmm.
them, but um, just to see the city actively working with the
Hmm.
homeowners and the project to work on that. So
Well, and
that's
that's a
why I
great
got
point that I want to.
interested.
Yeah, and I want to build on that a little bit because I think that has been one of the most interesting things for me is like I definitely like came into this work with a stereotype about the suburbs. And if you look at the history of the creation of the suburbs, like yeah, that stereotype is kind of born out. Like these are
Hmm.
born as places of racial exclusion. But because of that, it has been so like interesting to see the ways in which some of these suburbs, particularly these first ring suburbs, are interacting with this history now because you have places like Mounds View or Richfield or Columbia Heights or Bloomington that are not white anymore. Like or like they're diverse places like the rest of our country. And as people have started to realize that, like it's been really um gratifying to see the ways in which their leaders are taking this on and saying like we don't want to be remembered just for that. We want a different future and we want to serve our residents today. Like and so like yeah, like so it's been great to interact with Mountains View City Council. Falcon Heights has been super proactive. Again, like a place that is like very, very heavily covenanted. Columbia Heights, their city council has been super active. Golden Valley has been really active, and the some of the founders of Just Deeds work for the city of Golden Valley. Um, so it is really remarkable to me that like when we choose to not be defensive about this history and when we choose to engage with it, like better futures are possible, and it's possible to get past this and talk about what do we want to do next. And that's where the good conversations are. And so sort of my job is to like help people with that first step is getting over the hump of like how do we start talking about these things. But then like it's possible like I think the other side of the fact that we have this like really bleak century of history directed at people is that those were all decisions that people made, and we can
Hmm.
make different decisions, and we can choose to undo that damage. Because I think part of the mythology of race in this country is that it's destiny, and it's not destiny. These were decisions that we made, and so we can make new decisions.
Right. Like my city council choosing to be active and working
Hmm.
on this and facing it as a community. So,
Right.
and
Hmm.
that's a way to get involved in your own community is to encourage things like that.
Hmm.
Okay, good. More people have brought more questions. Um, I have someone who lives in St. Louis Park, which famously did not have an anti-Jewish covenant, but I don't know about its racial covenant history. Do they tend to track together?
This is a great question. I think there is perhaps a misunderstanding that people have about St. Louis Park that like yeah there are a lot of racial covenants in St. Louis Park, and also this is a place where Jewish communities move in the post-war period, and so it is kind of a confusing landscape, and it is both true that Jews are targeted by racial covenants, particularly earlier ones, but Jewish people are also moving to covenanted neighborhoods, and that history is a little more complicated. And in fact, we see some Jewish developers even putting in covenants. And so Jewish communities are in this sort of um, liminal space where they are both targeted and participate in this process. And I think like that's a complicated place to be, but I think it helps us understand a little more about the ways in which these things work together.
Okay. Um, let's see. Do you see any difference in home ownership trends between immigrants of color and people whose families have been here for a long time?
I'm gonna say like I'm not an expert on this. I think the
Mhm.
answer is yes. But like I don't feel like I can throw a lot of figures at you. But I think definitely like there is a difference in those experiences, and I think like this has been one of the really sticky wickets. Is that like particularly for African Americans, it's just been like really challenging um to get past the cycle because of the multiple waves that generations of families have fought against. And I think that is a little that's just a different experience in some cases than immigrant communities who are coming in later. Uh, but like yeah, that's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to go too far down that road. But,
Okay. In terms, okay, they put it in chat. Remember to put your questions over in
hmm,
Q&A, but I'm gonna bring this one up. Have you looked at school data such as
hmm.
subsidized lunch data, standardized test results versus areas with former covenants?
Well,
Have you?
and I'll say like we haven't directly, like other people certainly are looking at that. And so again, like this, I think like here's where like we feel like our primary job in the data realm is to just get put
This,
together the data about covenants and provide the data for other people to do that secondary research. And
yeah,
so I think there is a lot of like research that is going on in schools, but I'm probably not gonna be able to cite that for you today. I think like it would be shocking to me if there is not a
correlation.
correlation like and I think again this is a way in which like if you have ever been to an urban, even a well resourced urban high school and a suburban high school in Minnesota, like that's all the answer you need. I mean, the level of investment in these places that historically have been accessible to people and have not been accessible to people is extreme. And like I
Mhm.
love my St. Paul schools, I really do. But then when I go out to some of these suburbs and see what people have access to, it's wild to me. But
Yeah. Um, so so I was saying, is this a problem that is currently going away?
huh. Well, I mean, I guess it means which problem are
Which
we talking
problem? I'm
about?
not quite
Yeah.
sure. I'm gonna guess
But let's talk about housing disparities, like specifically. And I
yeah.
think the answer is unfortunately no. And unfortunately that like we have seen like in the previous few years, we've seen that the number of black homeowners tick up a little bit, but we've also seen white homeownership go a little bit. So we're not really making much progress on the gap. Like and even to the extent that we are, I don't see a long-term pattern. And I think particularly now, um, anyone who's tried to buy a house or sell a house in the last couple of years know like how incredibly competitive the market is right now, and it's just I just don't see how people can compete. Um, so that doesn't mean that we should give up or that like nothing's going on. Like I do see really promising things that people are working on. Like one is that I think there is an increasing recognition that things like credit scores that are ostensibly race neutral are have been a problem of have been a part of this problem. And so I see some experiments in figuring out how do we make credit scores either less important in these lending decisions or how do we um, find different ways for people to build credit that don't rely on already having family wealth. Um, I've seen a growing recognition in some of these industries, like I said, in the real estate industry, of recognition of these historical practices. um, Another industry is I think this conversation is just starting is in home appraisals because there's a very clear and stark difference in the values that are attached to homes in historically redline neighborhoods versus neighborhoods that were previously advantaged. And I'm sure many of you have seen these studies that people have repeated over and over again. Whereas like if you have an appraiser come in and there's photos in the house of a black family, and then you come out and you replace those photos with photos of a white family, the appraisal is much higher if you put up photos for the white family. And I don't think that's because the appraiser is intentionally doing something nefarious. I think it's because the reality is that we as a society, like we view white property as more valuable than black property. And I think like that is a conversation that is still in its early stages. Um, and I think like that industry is really grappling with what it like just following the numbers is something that has got us into trouble before, and trying to see past that and understand that unconscious bias that is underlying some of these things, or even the fact that like yeah, it is true that like that house will get sold for more money than that house, but that is because of the century of inequality. So is that really what we want in the future, and how do we work on that? I see lots of people who care about this. I see lots of people who want to work on this. I think it is not easier to do this work when people are trying to pretend that this history didn't happen and like attacking all of the people who are trying to do this.
Mhm. Okay, I have someone mentioning that they get their hair cut at the Groveland Barber
Oh,
Shop,
awesome. Love them.
and they're looking
Yeah.
forward to having a discussion with the current owner about
Yeah,
this.
they would. Yeah, and they've been great. Like they actually Tej, I don't know if you go to Tej or LJ, but Tej is the one who actually told me about Turner Starks, and they've been such great allies on this project and have been super invested in learning more about this history. So, and I think like that story, because it's just across the street from Groveland Park Elementary, and that's where my kids have gone to school, it's such a powerful teaching opportunity, like to have the kids see the school there and learn about that history. And some of the teachers there have already engaged with that, and it's been and I think this is another key thing is like there's more of those stories out there, and the more we can tell those local stories that are directly relevant to people in their own neighborhoods, that's also going to help people to see their neighborhoods in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the fact of choosing to be in a more diverse neighborhood
Mhm.
these days makes a difference. My son, when he went to college, went to UW River Falls for his freshman year, and he was going, "It's so not diverse, Mom. I can't handle it." So he
Mhm.
came back to the Twin Cities. But that's also a thing of making a choice to connect to a diverse community and
Mhm.
be actively engaged in it and help to promote just that. And I see this as being part of that. Okay, one thing. And she says, I see both Tej and Joe. So
Cool. Yeah. Nice.
okay. Well, we don't have any more last chance to get a question in here while I do a quick little wrap up. As I said, this is being recorded. We will get that up. We'll let you know when those are up. Um, Also, next week we are looking at 50 years of the Hmong in Minnesota. We have the director of Hmong Studies at Concordia University will be here, and I'm looking forward to that talk also. And another compliment to you of a great presentation from one of our participants. So, um, okay, not seeing any more questions. Michael, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to challenge everyone?
I mean, I just think like thank you for coming, thank you for listening. I know that if you're someone who's interested in this, like again, people are trying to tell you that no one cares about this stuff, and I just want you to know that like look around you. There's 100 people on this call. Lots of people care about this stuff, and let's just keep talking about it. So
Right, and that's the best thing we can do. Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Are
Mhm.
rolling into you for you. Yeah, everyone just keep talking, and this is a great jumping off point. And you can go to just type in mapping prejudice in Google, and it will bring you immediately. The top answer is the University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice Project, and click on there and learn more. So,
All right.
okay, well,
Thank you,
thanks.
everybody.
Thanks everyone for making it a great session.